says you're hopeless. God says you're hopeful. The enemy says you've been isolated. God says you've been included. The enemy says you'll always be lonely. God says you'll always be loved. The enemy says you're miserable. God says you can be motivated. The enemy says you're a nobody. God says you're notable. The enemy says you're overwhelmed. God says you're an overcomer. The enemy says you're pitiful. God says you're powerful. The enemy says you're going to be a quitter. God says, no, you're being quickened. The enemy says you've been rejected. God says you've been received. The enemy says you're shaken. God says you're safe. The enemy says you're tarnished. God says you're transformed. The enemy says you're unknown. God says you're understood. The enemy says you're a victim. God says you're a victor. The enemy says you're weak. God says you're whole. The enemy says you've been excluded. God says you're extraordinary. The enemy says you're yuck. God says you're yes, and you're mine. The enemy says you're zapped, and God says you are zealous. Would you give God praise for how He sees you?